An old Army veteran thought the woods behind his West Virginia cabin were empty, until his German shepherd stopped at a muddy ravine and refused to move. What they found buried there would change a forgotten woman's life forever. Like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The old soldier thought the woods behind his cabin had nothing left to say. For 6 years, Thomas Keller had walked the same trail every morning with Atlas at his side, past the leaning oak, past the rusted fence wire, past the narrow bend where the ground dropped toward a ravine the locals called Widow's Cut. He knew every root that could catch a boot, every low branch that brushed his shoulder, every place where deer crossed after rain. At 57, Tom trusted familiar things because unfamiliar ones had taken too much from him. The war had taken sleep. A roadside blast had taken the easy bend from his right knee. One terrible afternoon in Afghanistan had taken a young soldier named Evan Brooks, and with him some quiet part of Tom that never found its way home. Now he lived alone in Red Hollow County, West Virginia, in a cedar cabin with a tin roof, a wood stove, and too many evenings that ended with him staring into a cup of coffee gone cold. Atlas was the only living soul who never asked him to explain. The German shepherd was 9 years old, broad-chested and sable-coated, with amber eyes that watched the world like they were still scanning for danger. He had once been a military working dog, trained to find explosives, wounded men, and trouble before trouble found them. His left hind leg had never healed right after their last deployment, but he carried the limp with a kind of quiet dignity, as if pain was just another order he had accepted. That morning came after a hard night of rain. The hills were soaked black. Mist hung between the pines, thin and pale, like breath from something sleeping underground. Tom stepped off the porch in his old field jacket, the name patch long removed, and whistled once. Atlas was already waiting by the trail, ears lifted, nose pointed toward the trees. "All right, old man," Tom muttered. "Let's move." The forest smelled of wet bark, clay, and iron. Water dripped from the branches in slow taps. Mud pulled at Tom's boots, and the creek below the ridge ran fast and brown, carrying leaves, twigs, and pieces of the storm away. For a while, there was only the rhythm of walking. Tom's careful steps, Atlas's softer ones, the hush of rainwater falling from the canopy. Then Atlas stopped, not paused, stopped. His body went still in a way Tom knew too well, every muscle alert, every sense aimed at something Tom could not yet see. Atlas? The dog did not bark. That was what made Tom's hand tighten around the flashlight in his pocket. Atlas barked at coyotes. He growled at strangers. He huffed at squirrels like they had personally insulted him. But now he only stared down the washed-out slope, ears forward, tail low, and let out a small sound Tom had not heard in years. A thin, controlled whine. The sound he used to make beside wounded men before Tom reached them. Tom felt the morning turn cold inside his chest. "What did you find?" Atlas stepped carefully down the slope, favoring his bad leg, then looked back once. Not asking permission, giving an order. Tom followed, sliding on the red clay, catching himself on wet roots. Halfway down he saw it. At first, it looked like a shadow where the hillside had split open. Then the mist shifted, and a straight line appeared beneath the mud. Nature did not make lines that straight. Tom crouched and wiped the clay away with his bare hand. Old wood, black with age, swollen with damp, hidden under roots thick as wrists. He cleared more earth and found the corner of a wall, a narrow window with no glass, and the top of a small stone chimney broken off near the bank. It was a house, or what was left of one, buried in the hill like the forest had swallowed it whole and kept quiet. Atlas sat before a low, rotted door tangled in vines. His head bowed slightly, almost respectful. Tom clicked on his flashlight. The beam slid over the door, and there, scratched into the inside surface, were short marks grouped in fives, counted days, counted nights, counted prayers. Tom swallowed. He had walked past this place for years, so had hunters, surveyors, boys on dirt bikes, county workers clearing storm damage. Everyone had passed it by, everyone except Atlas. The dog looked at him with those steady amber eyes, and Tom understood something he could not yet explain. This was not an abandoned place. It was a waiting place. He laid one muddy hand against the door and whispered, "Okay, boy, let's see who needed to be remembered." Before Thomas Keller opened the buried door, he stood there longer than he needed to, one muddy hand resting on the rotten wood, listening to the rainwater drip from the roots above him. Men who had lived through war developed strange habits. They checked exits in diners. They sat with their backs to walls. They counted sounds before they trusted silence. Tom had once been the kind of man people called steady. Not cheerful exactly, but steady. A combat medic in the army, he had carried blood in his hands and prayer in his throat through places most Americans only saw in 10-second news clips. He had learned how to stop bleeding with one knee in the dirt, how to talk a terrified 19-year-old through pain, how to keep his voice calm when the world around him was cracking open. Back then, soldiers called him Doc Keller, and there had been comfort in that name. It meant someone believed he could help. It meant when men screamed, they screamed for him. But the name had followed him home like a debt he could never pay. In 2012, outside a village whose name Tom still could not say without tasting dust, a young private named Evan Brooks had looked up at him from the road and whispered, "Tell my mom I wasn't scared." Tom had lied, because mercy sometimes wore the face of a lie. "You're going to tell her yourself," he had said, pressing both hands against a wound too deep for hands, too fast for prayer, too final for courage. Evan died before the helicopter touched down. He was 22, he had a crooked smile, a folded photo of his little sister in his helmet band, and a mother in Ohio who sent peanut butter cookies to the whole unit every Christmas. After that day, Tom kept serving because men still needed him. But something inside him had gone quiet in a way no doctor could measure. Years later, when retirement papers came and people thanked him for his service with soft voices and careful eyes, Tom nodded like a polite stranger. He moved to Red Hollow County because no one there knew what he had failed to save. He bought the old cedar cabin at the edge of the woods, fixed the roof, stacked firewood, worked 3 days a week at Miller's tractor repair, and kept his life small enough that it could not collapse all at once. Small house, small town, small conversations, black coffee, canned soup, morning walks, nightmares he never mentioned. Then Atlas came. The army listed the dog as retired due to injury, but Tom knew better. Atlas had not retired. Atlas had been dismissed from a world that no longer knew what to do with old heroes who limped. The first time Tom saw him again at the kennel outside Fort Bragg, the German Shepherd had lifted his head but did not wag his tail. He simply looked at Tom as if they had both been waiting for the same bad dream to end. "Yeah?" Tom had whispered through the chain-link fence. "I know." From then on, they belonged to each other without ceremony. Atlas slept beside Tom's bed, followed him from room to room, and woke him from nightmares by pressing his heavy head against Tom's chest until the old soldier remembered where he was. Some mornings, Tom would open his eyes to find the dog watching him with that patient amber gaze as if saying, "Still here, still breathing, try again." People in town liked Atlas. Children wanted to pet him. Old men outside the feed store called him handsome. But Tom understood there was more to the dog than obedience and scars. Atlas noticed sorrow. He could pick it up the way other dogs picked up meat or rain. He sensed the moment a person's smile became a mask. He knew when Tom's hands started to shake before Tom did. That was why, standing before the buried house in the wet ravine, Tom did not dismiss the dog's strange stillness. Atlas was not curious. He was grieving, or remembering. The thought made Tom's skin prickle under his jacket. He looked again at the scratched marks on the door, grouped in fives, neat at first, then desperate near the bottom. Whoever made them had been counting time with a blade in fear. Tom thought of Evan, of all the names carried home in boxes, of all the people reduced to dates, reports, folded flags, and signatures. He thought of how easy it was for the world to move on when it did not know a person's face. Atlas shifted beside him, his bad leg trembling slightly in the cold mud, but he did not leave. Tom reached down and rested his hand on the dog's head. The fur was damp, warm underneath, alive. "You and me, huh?" he said softly. "We don't walk away from people who are waiting." Then, for the first time in years, Tom felt something stronger than guilt move inside him. Not hope, not yet, but purpose. And for a man who had spent 6 years merely surviving, purpose was almost too bright to touch. Red Hollow County had a way of making people feel both sheltered and trapped. From the ridge above Tom Keller's cabin, the hills rolled out in dark green folds, stitched with mist and cut by narrow roads that twisted like old scars through the valley. In spring, mountain laurel bloomed along the creek beds. In October, the hardwoods burned gold and red so brightly they looked almost holy. But beauty, Tom had learned, could hide a hard life the way fresh snow hid broken glass. The county had been built on coal, and coal had taken its payment in backs. Lungs, marriages, and names carved too small on cemetery stones. The old Blackridge mine sat 4 miles east of his property, sealed behind a sagging chain-link fence and a sign so weather-beaten only 3 words still showed clearly. Danger. Keep out. The mine had closed in 1991 after a fire deep underground, though people in town did not all agree on what had happened. Some called it an accident. Some called it negligence. Most lowered their voices and changed the subject, because in places like Red Hollow, history was not gone. It sat at the counter in the diner. It leaned against fence posts. It coughed in church pews on Sunday morning. It remembered who had money, who had none, and whose grief had been politely ignored. Tom had not grown up there, but the county had accepted him in the cautious way poor mountain towns accepted outsiders who kept to themselves. Folks nodded at him in the hardware store. Mrs. Lacey at the grocery slipped Atlas a biscuit when she thought Tom was not looking. At Miller's tractor repair, men spoke around pain instead of through it, which suited Tom fine. A broken axle, a bad starter, a cracked hydraulic line. Those were problems with shapes. You could point to them, name them, fix them, or fail honestly. Human damage was messier. Red Hollow carried plenty of that. Empty storefronts lined Main Street beneath faded awnings. The movie theater had been closed since 2008. A brick Union Hall stood boarded up beside the rail spur, its roof buckled under years of rain. Across from it, a bronze plaque listed miners lost between 1934 and 1989. But there was a blankness after that, as if the county had simply run out of courage to keep counting. Tom had passed that plaque many times and never stopped long. He told himself it was because those names were not his. Now, standing in the wet ravine with Atlas beside him and the buried door before him, he wondered how many people had been left off stone because someone important decided they were not worth remembering. The land around Widow's Cut had once belonged to a cluster of mining families. According to the old survey map Tom had seen when he bought the cabin. Small plots, poor soil. Houses built by hand from whatever men could afford after payday. Most were gone now, swallowed by trees or bulldozed when the coal company sold off parcels after closing. The forest had grown over everything with patient authority. Vines covered fence lines. Roots split foundation stones. Saplings rose through what used to be kitchens, bedrooms, porches where women may have shelled beans while waiting for whistles to blow from the mine. Tom looked at the hidden structure again. It was too small to be a proper house, too carefully built to be a shed, a shelter, maybe. A place made by someone who expected trouble and loved someone enough to prepare for it. Atlas lowered his nose to the threshold and breathed in slowly. The dog's ears twitched, but he did not cross inside. Tom respected that. Some places required permission even when everyone who could grant it was gone. Above them the ravine walls dripped red clay. Somewhere high in the trees a crow called once, then went silent. Tom thought of the county's old stories. Miners paid in company scrip, widows fighting for checks that never came, children leaving as soon as they were old enough to drive. He thought of men labeled careless because dead men could not defend themselves. He thought of women called unstable because grief made them loud in rooms where power preferred quiet. The air inside the buried doorway seemed colder than the forest around it. Tom drew his flashlight, but did not step in yet. He had come to Red Hollow hoping to disappear into a place already accustomed to forgotten things. Instead, the land had opened at his feet and handed him one more silence to answer for. Atlas leaned lightly against his leg, warm and solid. Tom looked toward the direction of Blackridge Mine, hidden beyond hills and fog, and felt the first thin thread connecting the buried shelter, the scratched marks, and a county that had learned to survive by not asking too many questions. "All right," he said, not loudly, because the woods did not need loudness. "Let's find out whose story got buried out here." Tom did not open the door right away. A younger man might have forced it, eager to prove courage by breaking whatever stood in front of him. Tom had lived long enough to know that some doors were not barriers. Some were wounds. He crouched in the mud, studying the frame while Atlas stood beside him, still as a carved thing, his amber eyes fixed on the dark seam where the door met the earth. The hillside had shifted badly in the storm. A whole curtain of red clay had slid away, exposing the front of the structure but leaving the roof pinned beneath roots and packed soil. One wrong pull could bring half the bank down. Tom slipped the flashlight between his teeth and worked slowly with both hands, clearing mud from the lower edge of the door, then from the rusted hinge straps. Water ran cold over his knuckles. The smell grew stronger as the gap widened. Wet ash, old wood, iron, and a stale human closeness that made his stomach tighten. Not death. Exactly, something worse in its own way. Waiting. Easy, he whispered, though he was not sure whether he meant the door, the dog, or himself. Atlas gave no answer. The shepherd lowered his head and pressed his nose near the threshold, breathing in short, careful pulls. Then he stepped back. Tom noticed that too. Atlas had once walked into rooms where men with rifles hid behind curtains. He had crossed roads seeded with explosives. He did not scare easy. But he would not cross this threshold. Not yet. Tom wrapped one hand around a broken plank and pulled. The wood groaned, soft at first, then sharp like an old throat remembering pain. A strip of rotten bark snapped loose. Mud fell in clumps. The door opened inward maybe 6 inches. Enough for the darkness inside to seem to lean toward him. Tom shone the flashlight through the crack. The beam cut across a low room, no bigger than a garden shed, though someone had made it livable once. There was a small stone hearth against the far wall, choked with old ash. A table leaned on 3 legs, a rusted lantern hung from a peg. Along one wall, shelves sagged beneath jars gone cloudy with age. The floor was half buried in dirt, leaves, and the fine powder of things time had eaten. Then the light caught the wall beside the door. Tom stopped breathing for a second. The marks were everywhere, not just a few. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Short vertical scratches carved into the wood in groups of 5. Some straight and careful, others jagged, crowded, frantic. Near the bottom were smaller marks, lower than the rest, as if a child had copied what an adult was doing. Tom felt something move under his ribs. In Afghanistan, he had seen men count days on concrete with nails, bottle caps, pieces of wire. Counting meant you believed time still led somewhere. Counting meant you had not surrendered. Atlas let out a low whine, barely more than breath. Tom reached behind him and touched the dog's shoulder without looking away from the room. "Somebody stayed here," he said. The words sounded too plain for what they meant. He pushed the door another inch. Something scraped on the other side and Tom froze. The beam dropped to the floor. A small object rolled from behind the door and stopped against his boot. For one strange second he thought it was a shell casing. Then he bent down and picked it up. It was a child's button, pale blue, shaped like a little flower, caked with dirt around the edges. Tom held it in his palm. It weighed almost nothing. That was the cruelty of it. The smallest things could carry the heaviest stories. Atlas sniffed the button once, then looked toward the room again. This time his tail lowered completely, not tucked in fear, but solemn, as if he had just confirmed what he already knew. Tom placed the button carefully in his jacket pocket. He had no evidence yet, no names, no dates, no right to feel the grief gathering in his chest. Still, he felt it. The buried shelter was no longer a curiosity. It was a message that had taken 35 years to reach the surface. He looked up at the roots gripping the roof, at the mud still sliding in thin streams down the bank, at the little room waiting in the earth. A storm had uncovered it, but Atlas had understood it. That was the difference. Weather could reveal a door. Only loyalty could insist someone open it. Tom stepped back from the threshold and drew a slow breath. He would need tools, gloves, a tarp, maybe county records, maybe more courage than he had brought with him that morning. Atlas turned toward the trail, then looked back once, the same way he had when leading Tom down the slope. Not finished, his eyes seemed to say, not even close. Tom nodded, "I know. Boy." He took one last look inside, and the flashlight beam trembled across the child's low scratches on the wall. "We'll come back." Tom returned the next morning with a canvas tool bag, a pair of work gloves, a folded tarp, 2 flashlights, and the uneasy feeling that he was not going back to a place but to a person. The rain had stopped, though the woods still held its breath in wet silence. Atlas walked ahead of him, limping but determined, never straying far from the trail, never stopping to sniff the ordinary things that usually interested him. When they reached Widow's Cut, the German shepherd descended the slope first and sat before the buried door as if he had guarded it through the night. Tom stood above him for a moment, looking at the black mouth of the shelter in the hillside. In daylight it seemed less frightening, but sadder. Sunlight touched the exposed roots, the broken chimney, the warped boards, and made everything look tired rather than dangerous. All right, Tom said softly. Let's be careful with her. He did not know why he called the place her. Maybe because abandoned houses, like old widows, seem to hold grief in their bones. He braced the door with a shovel handle and eased it open inch by inch. The hinges complained. Dirt spilled inward. Atlas remained outside, nose low, watching. Tom ducked through the opening and stepped into the shelter. The air was close and cold. His flashlight beam moved slowly, respectfully, over the room. It was smaller than he expected, but not careless. Whoever had built it had known how to make fear livable. Stones had been stacked tight around a little hearth. A narrow shelf had been nailed above it. 2 tin cups sat there, one large, one small. A child's cup. Tom swallowed and moved the light away. Against the back wall leaned the remains of a cot. The blanket on it nearly dissolved into gray threads. Beside it sat a wooden crate filled with rusted cans, their labels long peeled away. A blue enamel mug lay on its side beneath the table, chipped at the rim. On the wall above the hearth, smoke had left a dark stain shaped almost like a hand reaching upward. Tom turned slowly, taking in each object the way he used to assess a casualty, not judging, only noticing. The table had knife marks along one edge. The floorboards near the hearth were worn smooth. Someone had paced there, someone had waited there. Then his light caught the wall of tally marks again. Up close, they were worse. The first rows were neat, carved with patience. Later rows wandered, pressed too hard into the wood, crossing over one another as if the hand that made them had begun to shake. Lower down, the smaller marks appeared again, uneven and innocent, a child imitating hope without understanding it. Tom closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, Atlas was standing in the doorway, his ears forward, but he still would not come inside. "You smell it, don't you?" Tom whispered, all that waiting. The dog gave a quiet huff. Tom knelt to examine the floor. Near the hearth, one board sat slightly higher than the rest, its edge lifted by age. Atlas suddenly stepped forward just enough to stretch his neck inside and paw the threshold once. Then again, eyes fixed on that board. Tom froze. "There?" Atlas stared. Tom slid his pry bar under the loose plank and worked it gently upward. The nails groaned free. Beneath the board was a hollow space lined with oilcloth, and inside it, wrapped like something sacred, sat a rusted metal lunchbox. Tom lifted it out with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. On the lid, beneath a smear of clay, someone had scratched 3 letters with a nail. RW. His pulse thudded once. Hard. He set the box on the table and opened it. Inside were letters tied with a faded shoelace, a Polaroid photograph curled at the corners, a silver child's bracelet, a miner's union pin, and a small envelope browned with age. Tom picked up the photograph first. A young man stood in work clothes beside a woman with tired, kind eyes. Between them was a little girl in pigtails, smiling with the complete trust of a child who believed both hands holding her would never let go. On the back, in blue ink, someone had written, "Caleb, Nora, and Ruthie Ward." Summer 1990. Tom's throat tightened. He opened the small envelope last. The paper inside was brittle, the handwriting uneven but clear enough to read. "If anyone finds this, tell my little girl she was never abandoned. Her father did not leave us. He went back to help. Please, if there is any mercy left in this world, let Ruthie know she was loved." For a long time, Tom did not move. Outside, Atlas lowered himself to the mud, head on his paws, as if the dog had carried the message as far as he could, and now trusted Tom with the rest. Tom folded the letter with shaking care and placed it back in the box. He had come looking for an explanation. What he had found was a plea. Tom did not sleep much that night. The metal lunchbox sat on his kitchen table beneath the yellow light, quiet as a confession. Atlas lay beside his chair, head on his paws, watching him with the steady patience of a dog who knew that some wounds needed time before they began to speak. Tom read Nora Ward's letter 3 times, then a 4th, not because the words changed, but because each reading seemed to make the room smaller. "If anyone finds this, tell my little girl she was never abandoned." He kept coming back to that line, not the part about Caleb, not even the part about mercy. That one word held him, abandoned. Tom knew what it could do to a person, that belief. He had seen soldiers survive bullets and break under the thought that no one was coming. By morning, the rain had thinned to a gray mist, and Tom drove into town with the lunchbox wrapped in an old towel on the passenger seat. Atlas rode in the back, his muzzle resting between the front seats, as if he too understood they were carrying something more fragile than paper. The Red Hollow Public Library stood between a boarded pharmacy and a church thrift shop, a narrow brick building with ivy climbing one wall and a flag that snapped weakly in the damp wind. Inside, the air smelled of dust, coffee, and old carpet. Mrs. Elaine Porter looked up from the front desk when Tom entered. She was 68, small-boned, silver-haired, with reading glasses hanging from a chain, and the sharp eyes of a woman who had spent her life noticing what other people tried to file away. "Morning, Mr. Keller," she said. "Atlas, you handsome thing." Atlas accepted the compliment with grave dignity. Tom set the lunchbox gently on the desk. "I need help finding someone who may not want to be found." Elaine's smile faded just enough. "That sounds like Red Hollow." He showed her the photograph first. Her fingers hovered over it before touching the edge, careful not to smudge a face 35 years gone. "Caleb Ward," she whispered. "My father worked the North Seam with him." Tom felt the first piece click into place. Elaine led him to the back room, where county newspapers sat on microfilm and old mine records filled cardboard boxes labeled in marker. For 2 hours they searched through 1991. Church notices, storm reports, layoffs, obituaries, union complaints, and then finally the headline: Black Ridge mine fire leaves 3 missing. Tom leaned closer to the grainy print. Caleb Ward's name appeared in the 3rd paragraph, but not as a hero, not even as a victim. The article said he had disappeared after an alleged dispute over safety violations and compensation. Another clipping 2 weeks later was worse. Company officials suggested Ward might have fled the area to avoid questioning. Tom stared at the words until they blurred. Elaine stood beside him, jaw tight. "That was a lie people found convenient," she said. Her voice had gone thin and hard. "Caleb complained about gas buildup for months. My father said he wouldn't shut up about it. Said somebody was going to die if the company kept pushing men underground." Tom pulled Nora's letter from the folder. She said he went back to help. Elaine nodded slowly, tears bright but unshed. "That sounds like him." They found more. A handwritten union note listing 2 trapped miners still alive after the first blast. A map marked by Caleb's initials near an emergency. Shaft, a compensation sheet showing families paid $18,000 after the disaster. Except beside Nora Ward's name was a red stamp. Reason: spouse under investigation. Tom sat back, anger rising quiet and cold. He had known bureaucracy could be cruel, but this had the shape of something uglier. A poor man had died saving others, and someone had turned him into a coward because cowards were cheaper to bury. Elaine looked at the old sheet and pressed her lips together. "Nora came here once," she said. "I was young, working part-time. She had Ruthie with her, little girl in braids. Nora asked to see the papers. She kept saying, 'He didn't leave us.' People thought grief had made her unstable." Tom folded his hands, noticing the scars across his knuckles, the way they looked pale under the library light. People believe paper faster than they believe pain. Elaine looked at him then, really looked, as if she understood he was not only talking about Nora. Outside, a truck hissed by on wet pavement. Atlas shifted near the door, ears lifting toward some sound nobody else heard. Tom gathered the copies, the photo, the denied claim, the mine map, each piece of paper feeling heavier than the last. He had come to find Ruth Ward. Now he understood he also had to find the truth the county had buried with her father. Before leaving, Elaine wrote one name and one address on a yellow library slip. Ruth Ward Miller, Marion Falls, Kentucky. "I don't know if she'll talk to you," Elaine said. Tom tucked the slip into his wallet beside Evan Brooks' old unit photo, a place he reserved for things he could not afford to lose. "She doesn't have to believe me," he said. "Not at first." He looked down at Atlas, who had risen and stood ready beside him. "We'll just bring her what her mother saved." The address in Marion Falls, Kentucky, led Tom to a narrow street behind a nursing home, where the houses sat close together with small porches, tired flower pots, and American flags faded by too many summers. It was just over 60 miles from Red Hollow, but the drive felt longer, as if every mile carried him farther from a mystery and closer to a living wound. Atlas rode quietly in the back seat, his head lifted, ears forward, not sleeping once. Tom had placed the metal lunchbox on the passenger seat, wrapped again in the old towel. Every time the tires hummed over a bridge or dipped through a bend in the road, the box shifted slightly, making a small dull sound that seemed too loud in the cab. He kept thinking of Ruthie in the photograph, 6 years old, pigtails tied with white ribbon, smiling between two parents who had no idea history was already reaching for them. Ruth Ward Miller lived in a pale blue rental house at the end of the block, the kind of house that looked clean but temporary, with wind chimes hanging by the door and a row of work shoes lined neatly on the mat. Tom sat in the truck for a full minute before getting out. He had faced gunfire with steadier hands. This was different. A bullet could be simple. A stranger bringing back pain had no clean protocol. Atlas gave a soft huff from the back seat, impatient but gentle. "I know," Tom said. No walking away. He lifted the lunchbox, climbed the steps, and knocked. The woman who opened the door was not the little girl from the photo, and yet she was. Ruth Miller was 41, with dark blonde hair pulled into a loose knot, tired green eyes, and a caregiver's posture, shoulders slightly forward, as if her body had learned to lean toward other people's pain. She wore navy scrubs with a name badge still clipped to the pocket. There was a faint red mark across one cheek, probably from where she had rested her face in her hand during a break. She looked at Tom, then at Atlas, and her expression tightened with the practiced caution of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. "Can I help you?" Tom removed his cap. "Mom, my name is Thomas Keller. I'm from Red Hollow County." The name did something to her face. Not much. Just a flicker around the mouth, a door closing before it opened too far. "I don't know anyone in Red Hollow." "I think you used to," Tom said. "When you were very young." Her eyes hardened. "Whatever this is, I'm not interested." She started to close the door. Atlas moved then, not forward exactly, just close enough to be seen. He did not bark or plead. He sat on the porch boards, tall and solemn, his amber eyes lifted to her with an old gentleness that made Ruth pause. Some animals ask for trust. Atlas seemed to offer it first. Tom held up the lunchbox with both hands. "Your mother's name was Nora Ward," he said quietly. Ruth went still. The wind chimes trembled in the small silence between them. "My mother died when I was 8, she said, but her voice had lost its edge. "And my father left before that." Tom shook his head once, slowly. "No, Mum, I don't believe he did." That was when the anger came back, quick and bright. "You don't believe? You drove here to tell me what you believe about my life?" Tom accepted the hit because she had earned the right to swing. "No, I drove here because I found something she hid for you." Ruth stared at the lunchbox as if it might bite. Her hand rose to her throat, then dropped. "Who are you really?" "A man whose dog found a buried shelter in the woods. He did not dress it up. He did not make it sound pretty. There were letters inside, a photograph, a bracelet with initials. He reached into his jacket and took out the small silver bracelet, polished only enough to reveal the letters RW. Ruth's face changed in a way Tom would remember for the rest of his life. Not shock, not belief, something more fragile, recognition fighting terror. She opened the screen door without seeming to know she had done it. "Where did you get that?" "From under the floorboards," Tom said, "near an old hearth." Ruth took the bracelet, and her fingers closed around it so tightly, her knuckles paled. For a moment, she was not 41. She was 6, trying to hold on to a shape from a room her mind had buried to survive. Atlas stepped forward and gently rested his chin against her knee. Ruth looked down. Her face broke, but only a little, like ice cracking on a pond before spring. "I don't remember much," she whispered, "just smoke. My mother crying. A blue cup." Tom nodded. "The cup is still there." Ruth covered her mouth. The world inside her had been built on one sentence: "They left you." Now that sentence had begun to tremble. Tom set the lunchbox carefully at her feet. "Your mother wanted you to know the truth." Ruth did not open it yet. She only stood in the doorway, holding the bracelet against her chest while Atlas stayed beside her, steady as a promise. Ruth did not agree to go back that day. She said yes on a Thursday, 3 days after Tom left the lunchbox on her kitchen table and drove home without asking for gratitude. Those 3 days changed the weather inside her house. She called in sick once, then went to work anyway because old people still needed breakfast trays, clean sheets, and someone to answer when they pressed the call button. But every evening, she came home, sat at the table, and opened one more letter. Nora's handwriting began neatly, then grew weaker with each page, as if hope itself had started to lose weight. On Sunday morning, Ruth arrived in Red Hollow wearing jeans, a gray coat, and the silver bracelet around her wrist. Tom was waiting by the trail with Atlas. She looked smaller than she had on her porch, not in body but in certainty. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," she said. Tom nodded. You don't have to know yet. Atlas walked beside her, slower than usual, as if he understood this was not a hike but a return. The woods were bright after days of rain, sunlight falling through the branches in broken gold. Ruth kept her eyes on the ground until they reached Widow's Cut. Then she stopped so suddenly Tom almost stepped into her. The slope, the exposed roots, the dark opening in the hill. Something in her face went blank with recognition. "I dreamed this," she whispered. "I thought it was just a bad dream." Tom said nothing. He helped her down the muddy bank, but she let go halfway and moved toward the shelter alone. At the doorway, Atlas sat. Ruth noticed. "He won't go in?" "Not unless you do," Tom said. Her hand trembled as she touched the doorframe. Inside, the little room waited in silence. The blue enamel cup sat on the shelf where Tom had left it. Ruth saw it and made a sound that was not quite a sob. "That was mine." She stepped in, one hand against the wall, moving like someone walking through water. Her fingers traced the tally marks, first the higher ones, then the low, crooked scratches near the bottom. "I made these," she said, barely breathing. "Mom would mark the days and I wanted to help." She gave a broken little laugh, the kind that hurt more than crying. "I didn't even know what we were counting." Tom stood near the doorway, giving her space. Atlas remained just outside, ears forward, guarding the threshold. Ruth turned toward the hearth. She used to sit there. Her voice grew distant. At night, she'd put me in the blanket and tell me Daddy was working. Then later, she said he was helping people. I remember asking why helping took so long. Tom opened the lunchbox and handed her the final letter. Ruth stared at it before unfolding it, as if paper could burn. The room seemed to lean closer. She read silently at first, then her lips moved over the words. "Ruthie, if they ever tell you your father left us, don't believe them. He went back because 2 men were still breathing. Your father did not leave. He chose to be human when the world chose profit." Ruth's knees weakened. Tom reached for her, but she waved him back and sank onto the edge of the broken cot. Tears slid down her face without drama, quiet and constant. "All my life," she said, "I thought I came from being unwanted." She pressed the letter to her chest. "I thought that was the first true thing about me." Atlas entered then. Not before. Not until the room had changed from a grave into a place where the living were allowed to stand. He crossed to Ruth and rested his head against her lap. She buried one hand in his fur and cried in a way that sounded younger than 41, younger than memory, almost like the child whose mark still lived on the wall. Tom turned his face toward the doorway and blinked hard. He thought of Evan Brooks, of promises made to the dying, of how truth sometimes arrived years too late and still mattered. Ruth looked up at last, eyes red but clear. "He didn't leave us." Tom shook his head. "No, Mom, and she didn't forget me." "No." Ruth looked around the small shelter, at the cup, the hearth, the scratches, the stubborn little room that had held her mother's love longer than any courthouse record had held the truth. "Then I want his name back," she said. Her voice was soft, but it did not shake, both their names. Tom looked at Atlas, then at Ruth. "We'll get them back." Getting a name restored, Tom learned, was harder than finding a house buried under 35 years of mud. The dead could wait quietly. Paper did not. Paper demanded forms, signatures, dates, proof, copies of proof, and then proof that the copies had not been invented by a grieving woman and an old soldier who should have known better than to disturb settled history. Ruth almost gave up after the first week, not because she stopped believing, but because believing had made her tired in a new way. For most of her life, pain had been a closed room. Now the door was open, and every county clerk, every missing file, every polite sentence that began with "unfortunately" felt like someone trying to push her back inside. Tom saw it happen at the records office in Red Hollow, when a young man behind the counter said, "Mom, with all due respect, this happened a long time ago." Ruth's face went pale, but she did not raise her voice. She only placed Nora's letter on the counter, flattened it gently with both hands, and said, "Not to me." The room went still. Atlas sat beside her chair, broad and quiet, his head high, as if guarding not a person but a truth. Mrs. Elaine Porter came with them the next time, carrying a cardboard box of copied newspaper clippings, union notes, mine maps, and a faded payroll sheet that showed Caleb Ward had been scheduled on the North Seam the morning of the fire. Elaine had also found her father's old pocket notebook, wrapped in plastic in a cedar chest. On one page, in cramped pencil, were 6 words that changed the shape of everything. Caleb went back for Harlan and Price. The county attorney, a narrow man with tired eyes and a coffee stain on his tie, read that sentence 3 times. He looked at Ruth, then at Tom, then at Atlas, who had fallen asleep with one paw resting on Tom's boot. "This won't be simple," he said. Tom almost smiled. "Nothing worth doing usually is." The hearing was held 2 weeks later in the basement room of the Red Hollow courthouse, because the main chamber had a leaking ceiling and half the lights did not work. Maybe that was fitting. Forgotten stories rarely returned under chandeliers. They came back in rooms with bad coffee, metal folding chairs, and people who were not sure whether they had come to witness history or gossip. Ruth sat in the front row wearing her nursing scrubs because she had come straight from a 12-hour shift. Around her wrist was the silver bracelet. In her lap was Nora's final letter. Tom sat beside her. Atlas lay between them, his old body stretched across the floor like a line no one was allowed to cross carelessly. When Ruth stood to speak, her hands trembled, but her voice did not. She did not make Caleb larger than life. She did not call him perfect. She said he was a miner, a husband, a father, a man who packed lunch in a dented pail and kissed his daughter's forehead before work. She said he complained about gas in the North Seam because he wanted men to come home alive. She said when the fire started, he had a chance to run, and he turned back instead. Then she paused, looking down at the letter her mother had carried through fear, hunger, and humiliation. "For 35 years, Ruth said, my father was remembered as a man who left. My mother was remembered as a woman who couldn't accept it. I am asking this county to stop punishing them for being poor enough not to be believed." No one moved. Even the old radiator seemed to quiet itself. The vote was not dramatic. 3 county commissioners, 3 tired nods, 1 motion entered into the record. Caleb Ward's status would be amended. His name would be added to the Black Ridge Mine Memorial as a casualty of the 1991 disaster and recognized for attempting to rescue Harlan Briggs and Samuel Price. Ruth covered her mouth, and for a moment Tom thought she might fall, but she stayed standing. Atlas rose slowly and leaned against her leg. A month later, on a cold, bright Saturday, half the town gathered near the sealed entrance of Black Ridge Mine. A new steel plaque had been bolted beside the old one. Caleb Ward, husband, father miner, rescuer. Beneath it, in smaller letters, he did not disappear, he was remembered. Someone had started a memorial fund with $20,000 pledged by local families, the union, and a few business owners who admitted quietly that their fathers and grandfathers had owed Caleb more than silence. The money would help children of injured laborers with school supplies, heating bills, and emergency care. It was not justice, not fully, but it was a hand extended across time. Ruth placed one palm on the plaque. Tom stood back, his throat tight, while Atlas sat at attention in the grass. For the first time in 35 years, Caleb Ward had a place in the world again. By early spring, the buried shelter no longer looked like something the hill was trying to hide. Tom did not restore it too much. He refused the idea of turning it into a polished little attraction with bright signs and souvenir photographs. Some places, he told the county board, did not need to be improved. They needed to be protected. So the roof was braced, the doorway cleared, the bank reinforced with stone, and a narrow path was laid from the old trail down into Widow's Cut. A wooden rail followed the slope for those whose knees, like Tom's, had learned the cost of years. Inside, nothing was staged. The blue enamel cup remained on the shelf. The tally marks remained on the wall. The little hearth stayed dark. Beneath a sheet of clear glass on the table lay copies of Nora's letters, Caleb's union pin, the mine map, and the photograph of 3 people standing in summer sunlight before the world changed its mind about them. Ruth kept the originals at home, wrapped in acid-free paper in a cedar box. "I spent my whole life without them," she told Tom once. "Now I'm learning how to have them slowly." On the first Saturday after the path opened, a small group gathered there. Miners' widows, schoolchildren, 2 county commissioners, Elaine Porter with a thermos of coffee, and a few old men who had worked Black Ridge when their hair was still black and their backs still straight. Ruth stood by the doorway in a navy coat, the silver bracelet bright against her wrist. Atlas sat beside her, older now, his muzzle more white than gray, but his posture still solemn enough to make the children whisper. Their teacher, Miss Hanley, brought the 4th grade class from Red Hollow Elementary. She had asked Tom to say a few words. He almost told her no. Words never felt trustworthy in his mouth unless they were instructions. Hold pressure. Breathe. Stay with me. But when he saw the children looking at the scratched wall, their faces quiet with the first understanding that history was not always printed in clean books, he stepped forward. This room was built by people with very little, he said. But little doesn't mean worthless. Poor doesn't mean forgettable. And when somebody's story gets told wrong, it matters that someone takes the time to tell it right. He stopped there. Anything more would have sounded like a speech, and Tom hated speeches. Ruth smiled at him through tears she did not bother hiding. After the children left, she walked inside alone. Tom waited outside with Atlas, giving her the privacy grief sometimes asks for even after it has softened. When Ruth came back, she carried the silver bracelet in her palm. For a moment, Tom thought she was taking it off forever. Instead, she knelt near the doorway and tucked it into a small shadowed groove beside the frame, where it could be seen but not touched. I don't need proof anymore, she said. I know who they were. Atlas rose slowly and pressed his head against her shoulder. She laughed one soft broken note and wrapped both arms around his neck. Tom looked away, not because he was embarrassed, but because tenderness could still hit him harder than sorrow. That evening, after everyone had gone, Tom stayed behind. The woods glowed with late sunlight. Water moved gently in the ravine below. The shelter, once buried and breathless, stood open to the spring air. He thought of Caleb Ward, who had gone back because 2 men were still breathing. He thought of Nora, carving days into wood so despair would not swallow her whole. He thought of Ruth, who had carried a lie for 35 years, and somehow still spent her life caring for the forgotten. Then he thought of Evan Brooks, 22 forever, asking for his mother in the dust. For the first time in years, the memory did not crush him. It stood beside him, painful and real, but no longer accusing. Maybe the living were not asked to save everyone. Maybe sometimes they were only asked to carry the truth far enough for someone else to receive it. Atlas limped to the doorway and sat facing the room. Tom lowered himself onto the bench outside, one hand resting on the dog's back. The plaque near the trail caught the last light of day. Caleb Ward, husband, father, minor rescuer. He did not disappear. He was remembered. Tom read the words once, then again, and felt the old silence inside him change shape. It was still there, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like a room with a door left open. "Good work, boy," he whispered. Atlas leaned into his hand, warm, tired, alive. Above them the trees moved in the wind, not like witnesses keeping secrets anymore, but like voices finally allowed to speak. If this story moved you, take a second to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories that remind us what loyalty and kindness can still do. And tell me in the comments, which moment touched you the most, and where are you watching from today?